Good morning. We are back at lecturing again. It's been a while since we've been together. If you have not completed everything up to chapter 22, I'm going to give you to Friday to get everything of chapter 21 or prior done. Chapter 22 will be new stuff this week, will be a normal timeline. But you had all last week to get caught up. I've got the last test. I'm going to finish up grading this week. I'm going to slowly get through everything this week. Chapter 22, I'm actually probably going to forego the reaction quiz this week. We'll see. But you need to make sure you are caught up by the end of the week. Okay? If you're not caught up, you get one freebie, basically, if you want to call it, for chapter quizzes that is excluded, and reaction quizzes. So if you don't do one, I'll just give you 0 and then that doesn't count. But if you do all your quizzes, I will throw out your lowest grade. So let's say you did all your quizzes and you got out to, you averaged 22, 23 on your quizzes, but then you had a really bad week or something, you forgot, and you got 15 out of 25, I would drop that if that was your lowest test or quiz score. So be cognitive of that. I'll put the announcement on there. But this week, we're getting into World War II. Here are the key points for this chapter. What steps led America into World War II? How did the resources promote support for the war? What visions of post-war world began to emerge during the war? How did American minorities face threats to their freedom at home and abroad during the war? And how did the end of the war begin to shape the post-war conflict? And then also, how do we even get into the war? So we got to understand even how the United States got into war. I'm going to take this week slowly. This might be a longer lecture series because World War II is, well, pretty awesome. Introduction. January 6, 1941, President FDR spoke eloquently of a future order founded on the essential human freedoms. And he said, they called them the 4 freedoms, if I remember right. They're freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Remember, we're coming out of the Great Depression in the 30s. That had been a turbulent time in the United States. The whole world had went through a depression, economic recessions all around the world. It wasn't a great time. World War I or World War II had been raging by this point for nearly 3 years in Europe, starting in the fall of 2 years, started in the fall of 1939. Now, the United States is neutral, but now FDR is starting to step up the rhetoric a little bit. He's just been reelected. Now we're looking at freedom of speech, freedom of worship, want, and need, or from fear, I should say. These are things that are starting to bog down in Europe. Became FDR's favorite statement of Allied aims. World War II also redrew the boundaries of American nationality. But this painting right here, up on the PowerPoint, you'll see it on your PowerPoint, on the introduction slide. You have the freedom of worship. You have the freedom of speech. You have the freedom from want. And you have the freedom from fear. So these 4 paintings illustrate the 4 freedoms that FDR is going to really summarize in 1941. And they become the rallying cry for a lot of the war. So that's where the 4 freedoms comes into this aspect. Now that being said, fighting World War II. Up until this point, the United States had been neutral. We had avoided war at all costs, but we're going to get to a position where war is inevitable. In the 1930s, Americans did not focus much on international events or items, as we discussed in the last lecture a couple weeks ago about the Great Depression. America was concerned about surviving. And if you've taken ever any of my American history courses, we go into great detail. In the 1930s, we really didn't care internationally because we were trying to survive. So, Hitler was terrible, but the grand scheme was, how does it affect me on a daily basis in America? It doesn't at this point. Roosevelt also formalized a policy initiated by Hoover, which the United States reputed the right to intervene in military action in the internal affairs of Latin America. Once again, we are not going to be heavily involved outside the Western Hemisphere, and we're going to be very limited in any engagement. Okay? So we've basically drawn our forces back. Now the road to war. Obviously, World War II is inevitable. I don't think there's any scenario but a few, if you do alternative history, in which the United States does not get caught up in World War II. Now, ultimately what's going to bring us into the war is not the events in Germany, which we focused on before. It's going to be the events in the Pacific. In 1931, Japan will invade part of China called Manchuria. They wanted resources. Manchuria was rich in resources. And thus they will occupy it for several years. But by this point, America's in a tailspin economically, so we're not going to even sniff around. 1937, Japan will overrun the city of Nanking or Nanjing, depending on the translation. 200,000 to 300,000 Japanese civilians or Chinese civilians will be killed by the Japanese. At this point, FDR did want to intervene, but he had no position at home. And remember, we're not part of the League of Nations. The League of Nations has no teeth. There is no repercussions for Japan's actions here. One of the darkest moments of the Chinese-Japanese conflict on sheer genocide, and I'm going to use that word because it's horrific. Japanese soldiers literally beheaded, went through, raped, pillaged, did anything they wanted in Nanking. It's still a hot topic between Japan and China. What I mean by a hot topic is it's a topic you don't broach, you don't bring it up. In 1936, Hitler will invade the Rhineland, a borderland between France and Germany. He'll take it back. No fighting. He just march troops in. Benito Mussolini will send troops into Ethiopia. He will need the German assistance to take Ethiopia, and he takes Ethiopia. 1938, Hitler announced the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland, an ethnically German part of Czechoslovakia. This is also known as, with the Austrian part, Anschluss, in which Hitler takes Austria. If you've seen the movie, Sound of Music. Anyone here seen Sound of Music at least once? Okay. If you're not, it's about the Von Trapp family singing group. Very good movie. Probably about 50% accurate as far as real events. Still a good movie. We watched it a couple weeks ago. One thing that's a note that I noticed when I watched it the second time, they used the word Anschluss and the acquisition of Austria into the German Empire. Once again, Hitler marches troops in. There's already collaborators in Austria that want to be part of Germany. Germany takes it. That means saying it wasn't universally loved that Austrians were now part of the German Empire, but they couldn't really stop it. FDR was limited on what he could do and had to accept the British and French policy of appeasement. So as Hitler expanded, Mussolini expanded, and as the Japanese expanded, FDR was tight. He couldn't stop anything from happening. And none of these countries were ready to go to war. Fighting the World War II, second slide. To most Americans, the war has not happened yet, but Europe was so far away. Even today, as I'm preparing for my second Europe trip, most of you think about, Europe's across the ocean. It's a long ways away. What happens in Europe takes a long time to get here, right? Even in today's modern world. So many Americans really didn't care what was going on in Europe. In fact, they were like, hey, good for them. Maybe this will clean out the gutters and stuff out over there. We practice isolationism. Some viewed Hitler's expansion as a good threat to communism. Communism was our threat that we had kind of tried to stave off. So maybe Hitler will stop that. Many Americans still felt World War intervention was a bad decision. World War I aftertaste was bad. You ever had something that you ate that has a bad aftertaste? Initially, it might have seemed good, but then you either get indigestion, heartburn, or something, and you're like, man, I really regret eating that. I bought a new coffee last night. We went shopping to St. Joe, and the packaging looked really good. It was cheap. I was like, I'm going to try this. I think it was German, actually. Espresso. Made it last night. Initially, it smelled kind of weird, and the initial taste was like, and then it was just like, oh gosh, what did I just drink? And I love coffee, if you know me at all. So it was one of the bad decisions, right? So that aftertaste lingers on from it. We are an isolationist, desire to avoid foreign entanglements. This actually even goes back to the views of Washington if you study American history long term. Neutrality Acts ban travel on belligerent ships and for the sale of arms to countries at war. So we're going to even limit how we trade internationally with countries that go to war. Now the war does kick off in Europe. By 1939, Hitler, Soviet Union, we're going to kick off war in Europe. In 1939, Soviet Union proposed an international agreement to oppose further German demands for territory. Britain and France refused, didn't like the Soviet Union at all. So the Soviet Union, rebuffed by the French and British, is going to go talk with Hitler himself. Hitler will make a deal with the Soviets, and basically when the Soviets invade Poland, the Soviet Union will invade Finland. They'll make an agreement where they won't fight each other. Now, obviously, that only lasted a couple of years, but this terrified the British and the French. So, September 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland. France and Britain will declare war. On June 14th, 1940, German troops will occupy Paris. So, very quickly, in the fall into the spring of 1940, so the fall of 39 and the fall of 40, or spring of 40, Hitler moves very quickly, right? You guys have studied this. We talked about this in great detail before. Though the German military was not necessarily vastly superior on all aspects, their tactics easily defeated the French more than anything. Italy, Germany, and Japan then will create an alliance known as the Axis powers, an agreement to help each other. For one critical year, Britain stood alone virtually in the fighting against Germany. This is where you get the famous events of Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain. Battle of the Dunkirk. So these forces, by the June of 1940, about 300-some thousand, mostly British forces combined with a few thousand French forces, are going to be surrounded at Dunkirk. They're one of the most unsung moments in World War II history that we often don't fully talk about or discuss. The Germans will push the British to the brink. If the British had lost these forces, there's a good chance that Churchill would have been forced to surrender or capitulate to the Germans. But because of these they literally will launch. It's a port city, right? If you've seen the movie Dunkirk, it goes into good detail about this. The British literally launch every single boat they have. It's like, Brock, you have a fishing vessel, Dalton, you have a sailing boat that's on there. You are not called to duty to help the British government. Doesn't mean you have to go into combat, but what you do is you go over there and you help ferry men off the beach, right? It's a very dramatic moment. After that, the Germans are trying to force the British to surrender by air war, which is very costly on both sides, but the thing is the British are resolved not to surrender under the leadership of Winston Churchill. In the Battle of Britain, which takes place mostly of November 1940 to 1941, the Germans will give everything that they got air-wise towards the British, trying to plan for a future invasion. But because the British hold off the Germans will abandon any effort to invade Britain. If the British islands fall before we're even in the war, we would have no staging area to invade Europe. Think about that. If the British had fallen and the Germans had occupied England, there would have been no staging ground for D-Day. So it was critical. And Roosevelt's trying everything he can to do to help the British government. Probably illegal actions, slowly giving them aid, but we're hand-tied because we do not want intervention. Here's Dunkirk. Literally thousands of troops are on the beach waiting to either be killed or escape. The top right is from the movie Dunkirk. Ultimately, though, the bulk of the forces will be saved. Fighting World War III towards intervention. We'll probably got another slide or so. Today's a shortened period. Toward intervention. So, fighting World War, slide 3. Americans still favored not being involved. Cash and carry policy also approved plans for military rearmament. We will start rearming ourselves. But what we're going to do is you cash and carry. You come to a U.S. port, you bring cash in tow, we will sell stuff to you. Not on loans, not on... You bring cash, we will sell right there. There'll be also American First Committee to oppose all involvement in Europe that will become prominent. They are going to, at all costs, try to avoid war. FDR announced a third term. World was too unstable to change. His opponent was Wendell Willkie. After the election, though, he doesn't get too interventionist yet, but after he wins, He comes out with Arsenal of Democracy, providing Britain and China with military supplies to fight against Germany and Japan. Arsenal of Democracy. We're going to promote democracy. These people are trying to oppress it. We're not going to get involved, but we'll give them supplies if they need it. We'll come up with the Lend-Lease Act to authorize military aid as long as it promises to somehow return it after the war. Mostly, this is a way to buy time to help the British. We're going to give the British anything and everything we can to some degree, and try to do it kind of cloak and daggers wise, kind of not outside the public eye. But the Germans knew what we were doing. Now, the one thing that FDR will finally get approved is we'll freeze Japanese assets in the United States, primarily money and oil. We're going to cut off oil supply to the Japanese, and we're going to freeze their money that's in U.S. banks. When we do that, it has a devastating effect on their war machine, and it will ultimately anger the Japanese to a high degree where they have no choice but to go to war. Okay, I'm going to leave Pearl Harbor for tomorrow because I want to go into full detail on it. Once again, make sure you're caught up on everything. I'm probably going to forego a reaction quiz this week, try to get everyone caught up. We'll probably just do a chapter quiz, probably post it Friday. Once again, if you have questions, email me, please. Feel free. Don't forget your book essay. Your book essay for the Cold War by Gladys, I think it is. We're going to have a week where we're going to work on that, but you need to be ramping up to prepare for it. We've got probably about a month and a half to that day, that week we get, but make sure you're not forgetting about that. All right, have a great day.